honor your time. And I will hit the share the screen button, all the things over here. All right, thumbs up. Are you seeing the slide deck?
Yes,
Perfect. All right, we'll be layering in things today, so I'll try not to make you sick with all the stuff flying on the screen, right? Okay, so welcome, and I will, if you will bear with me, I will kick us off with our preamble. And again, thank each of you for serving in this capacity, for creating and planning for a public school student-based formula. There, Lenny and Mr. Britt. Yeah, so thank you. So conversations on this topic are not intended to reflect on the current BEP funding formula. The current BEP funding formula will remain in place until a new funding formula is recommended to and approved. The public is encouraged to submit comments in writing to ensure that all communications are thoroughly documented and can be reviewed and considered in the future. Public comment is encouraged to focus on developing a new funding formula rather than revising the current funding formula, and consider what should be funded in a new funding formula and at what level. Subcommittees will be responsible for reviewing public comment and making recommendations for what should be included in the new funding formula. While all committees, subcommittees, and members of the public should feel free to communicate openly, documents and records may be subject to public inspection pursuant of the Tennessee Public Records Act and may be publicly posted or otherwise made available. All recommendations that are submitted by committees and subcommittees will be reviewed and considered, but not all recommendations will ultimately be included in the proposed new funding formula. Thanks again for bearing with me to read through our preamble. I appreciate that. I will, before I head, just in case we're close on time, I will scoot all the way to the end to say, so our last meeting is next week, and that's the date. Same time, same place, but I just wanted to pull that forward. That's meeting 6, and I'll now kick it back up to our Chairman Weeks, and we can move through.
Thank you, Janice. I appreciate that, and I appreciate each of you and your time today. I know specifically here in Middle Tennessee, we've kind of been fighting the weather and looking at the maps and the forecast across the state. I know several of you have also dealt with the weather, and I hope you're safe and staying warm today. But let's start off, Ms. Janice, if you don't mind calling our roll and making sure we record attendance today, please.
Yeah, happy to do so. So we have Dr. Danny Weeks, Mark Florence.
What I would do is just say.
And I'm not seeing the whole group, so if you'll say here, that'll help me.
Mark is present.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Gary Lilly, Dr. Steve Barnett.
I'm here.
Hi, Chad Moorhead.
I'm here.
All right. Diane is not with us today. Rob Britt.
I'm here.
Dr. Dyer.
I'm here.
Dr. Michelle Simcox.
Here.
Dr. Barker.
So glad to be here.
Senator Paige Wally. And Representative John Reagan. All right. Got that captured.
Thanks so much, guys, and everyone again for being here today. Today, we simply want to go back and look at the framework that's been shared with us, reviewing our notes and putting those notes along with the framework that we have. And so kind of juggling papers on your screen today. Janice is going to have a job doing that. But just making sure as we go through that everything related to the framework in terms of items to be included, items to be excluded or low prioritized from our committee standpoint, that we reflect those in our minutes so that those get sent to the steering committee. We also, toward the end of our meeting, so I'm going to probably try to divide the first 30 to 40 minutes with where we are, what we've seen, and those type things. And then the last 15 to 20 minutes or so, we'll devote toward the policies as we have talked about those, the policies, the definitions, the terminology, as we make sure that we get those defined. So Janice, if you want to go ahead to our next slide or two that we can kind of do those. Thank you. Again, so that's going to talk about that if you'll recall, the last public input was received on the 18th, so you have the majority of that feedback, I assume, and we'll get that before next meeting, and we'll be able to look at that. And again, we'll consider any of that to see if that impacts our decisions, our thoughts, and how that impacts those, and see if that makes any difference on our recommendations.
Yeah, so I'll pull over the draft framework, and I can, if you like, I'll go ahead and I'll pull over then recommendations from last time, if that's helpful, or I can
Yes,
wait
please.
for you. Okay.
Yeah, let's, if we can do that.
Mm-hmm. Of course. Cool. Can you see both okay?
They're a little overlapped. Our recommendations.
Which do you want
If
forward?
you could close the sidebar on
I'll just scoot it this way.
that would work. That's.
You want to see both? Is that what I'm hearing?
Is that a possibility?
Yeah, sure thing. Maybe just keep scrunching it down and we'll get it.
There we go. That helps.
Yeah. There we go.
So, ladies and gentlemen, on the left side of our screen, we have what the state has provided as that draft proposal. On our right side of our screens, we're seeing what again was captured as our conversations, our thoughts, and our input at our last meeting. And so we'd look at those type things to see and make sure this might be one of our last opportunities to provide direct input to those the outcome, the base, the funding, and the weights. So let's make sure that our notes reflect all of our conversation that we've had. They reflect the positions which we represent, and again, ours being school leadership, that it reflects those conversations we've had directly with others, that we've received from our organizations, that we've received from public comments, or any emails and personal communications you've had. And so, again, as we look at base, educator salaries, nurses, counselors, and school-based supports, and I was glad to see that school-based supports come in there. That's something I think we specifically talked about. RTI support, specific needs, technology, and coordinated school health. And so you see our conversation that we've had over on the right side. Do we see anything on the right side that we need to make sure we address, make sure it's very clear? Anything we want to bold or highlight and make sure it gets included so that the steering committee sees that clearly?
Hey, this is Chad Moorhead, and I apologize. I did miss our last meeting, and I'm probably off. Somebody can fill me in. As far as administration goes, I know we talked about a principal per school, and then the flexibility for assistant principals in the building, but anywhere in the formula that would include, and I assume it would be in the base, would include central office administrators and supervisors as well, shouldn't it?
Yes, sir. I think our conversation addressed district flexibility. It's right under on my screen, right under the bulleted list, about item number 3 down from there, right on it, Janice. There it says discussion, flexibility needed in districts, and we talked last week quite a bit about based on our schools' needs. Do we all need or want an SRO in every building? Do we all need or want a nurse in every building? Do we all need or want an AP in every building? And so when we talked about that, Chad, we've talked about, it could be based on the proximity of campuses, the size of that school, and things like that. So that's that little sentence right there was meant to explain that, and to be a pot of money that we would have that flexibility to use that for. One thing that I didn't notice, and I just saw it in several pieces of public comment that I was reading through, and Janice, you may help us with this. On the document that the state has prepared on our left, as compared to our document, it says educator salaries on the left side, and ours specifically mentions teacher salaries. So is that just an oversight on our part as a committee, or do we mean that to mean all educators, including support staff? Does that look at all salaries? Did we get that and talk about that specifically in terms of teachers?
I agree with you. I think that has been missing in the term educator. In our superintendent study council, we've had some discussions about the term educator. Does that mean all positions that require teaching license, or the new definition from the state legislature about what a teacher is? And I would contend it would be at least every position that requires a teaching license.
And, hey, this is Russell, and I know, I agree with what you said, Chad. That teacher salary is now defined in law and statute. So, do we just need to say salaries, period? And that way you are looking at both certified and what we consider classified folk, because you have to have both to run the school system, school nutrition, everybody else. And we need to make sure we're providing, the best salaries we can to attract the best folks.
And then also, thank you for clarifying that, Russell. I know we discussed it. I think it was at the superintendent's meeting that was held in Wilson County. I think there was also discussion about cost of living increases and things like that, so that it was not a stagnant formula that depended upon, like our current model where the BEP committee has to recommend that base salary for teachers and how it's adjusted each year or not. So cost of living increases in there. I see you placing that in there, Janice. So thank you for doing that.
Mm-hmm.
Danny, I think it does beg the question, though. So with the state's format, I'm pointing over here to that side where the where Janice has it over here. But with the educator salaries, I think one of the things that our conversations have really touched on is the specific need for teacher salaries, and the teacher salaries absolutely have to be in the base. And then I think the question would be, well, what about those teacher assistants that are out there? One of the things we've been thinking about and kind of brought it to the last meeting was the notion that we believe that based on the STAR data and studies that really kind of have a Tennessee basis, that we should consider a lowered class size for those K through 3s. And Representative Reagan, I think, brought some great points to the last conversation around, well, that may not necessarily be a necessity across all spectrum of schools across the state, but definitely a conversation that we can continue to have with that. But the question is, who else is there in that classroom? And I don't know if we've necessarily dug into that, right? Because if we say that there's a classroom assistant that's needed in K-1-2, for an example, and we would encourage that to be a part of the base, I think there's a philosophical statement that's to be made with this funding formula that would say, that it appears broader with that notion of educators' salaries, that and maybe what they're doing is they're being inclusive there, with educator salaries, that is the assistant principal, that is a principal, that is those others. But I think it does beg the question, what is the thinking of where that state's formula framework is right now relative to specific positions?
And I think as Russell and Chad pointed out, last year during legislative session, there was a specific definition of what a teacher is. And so, yes, I think, what would it end up being, 50% or 51% in front of a class, or
Right.
responsible for student learning. So we know that. And so as we look down again, the second bulleted list, I'm doing the same thing you're doing, John, pointing at my screen.
Yeah, right.
It says reconsider ratios right under the red central office, right near the bottom of that. Let's see if that addresses all of the concerns that we talked about. Outcome. So do we need to add something to that list, such as, are interventionists needed, or are access to interventionists, access to other support personnel? Is that what I hear you saying, John?
Well, I just, and that would be, I think we've got some clarity that's there. I think the question that we would probably have, Danny, for me would be, what in the state's framework, again, back to that side over there, what is included in what they're considering educator salaries? Because nurses, it's a very specific kind of type, counselors and school-based supports, very, very specific. When they talk about educator salaries, well, teacher is defined in state statute, educator is not.
Okay. Kenneth,
Yeah, I think that's going to be something that needs to be worked through, John. I agree with you. I mean, some of that's philosophical. One of the things that we believe, and I've believed through my career, is that the teacher does the heavy lifting. Teaching assistants are wonderful to have for certain jobs. At the end of the day, they're not accountable. The teacher's accountable. So we'd rather hire more quality teachers, put them in classrooms, and then provide some support. And those teaching assistants would be working in classrooms with teachers, working with small groups, what have you. Usually your stronger students, not your weaker students in the classroom, but not just hired to be in the building doing die cuts or what have you. They're really working with kids, but it limits the number of assistants that you may hire in some systems, and you're taking that additional funding and you're applying it to teacher salaries. And if you look across the state, you may have districts that hire a lot more teaching assistants. That's their philosophy. That's the way they do business. I'm not sure how we work through that in a formula.
And I think that's a good place to go back and point to that discussion we had. I guess it was 2 meetings ago about, there has to be flexibility for districts based upon our needs, our and like you said, our philosophies, because really that's what that is. And sometimes it's availability of workers. And so, while that definition can be cleared, there may be other areas that go back to the term flexibility that we've used. And I see that up there, so that we can address those varied needs of districts. Great points.
Does that clarify a bit?
I like Steve's definition. I liked his term philosophy. It's really a district belief or a district philosophy of how we do some of those things.
Mm-hmm.
We, based upon the needs of our communities, there are some things that are more important to one community than there are others. And I think we've clarified that as well.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and Danny, that is part of the base. It's like that's kind of right there. Immediately as the first bullet point, it's like there's some things that I just wonder if they were in the building of the framework, they were thinking that educator and teacher were synonymous. And I think that's to Janice's point there, to clarify that's there. Are they thinking specifically of educator salaries, or are they thinking about something else too there?
Hey, Representative Reagan, I see your hand.
Thank you. Again, I want to bring I'm sorry I was late to the meeting. There was a certain senator in my office that didn't want to leave. But anyway, the point that I wanted to bring up, when you're talking about customizing this to the districts, I think it's very valid. I've mentioned several times, we see statistical differences between urban versus rural and other categories. So we definitely need to have a customization piece. However, and this is big from my perspective in the legislature, it's one of accountability. That is to say, whatever measure we're going to use, ACT, TVOS, whatever, TN ready, I pick one, it doesn't matter. When we have a situation that we get a report on in one of the education committees I sit on that says we have problems in this district for that measure, pick the district, or this kind of district across the state, whether it's small schools, big schools, whatever. The accountability piece of that is, okay, what are we collectively going to do about it? Obviously, when we point the finger at that district and say, you got problems, the answer is going to come back to us. Yeah, we know, but we need money to solve it or whatever. We need to hire more teachers. We need to hire more assistants. We need to hire whatever, pick something. But from my perspective, in terms of accountability, when I'm in front of that committee, whether I'm making the pitch to them or sitting on the other side listening to the pitch, as the question arises, accountability, what are we going to do about it? Who has got to step forward and say, this is the problem based on the measure? We all have to agree on the measure, whatever it is we're talking about. ACT, again, is one I like to pick on because it's statewide. But that measure is indicating that we have a district, a school system that is in trouble. And what do we say has to be done? I can show you some scary statistics that prove throwing money at the problem doesn't necessarily solve it. From that perspective, I would ask you to think again, looking at, you guys are on the ground, you're there making things happen. And first off, let me say thank you, and let me say I appreciate it. Furthermore, let me say I think the great majority, overwhelmingly, of you do a great job. That said, though, we do have issues with certain portions of our state. And I mean, let's just face facts. The places where we have those issues have to be accountable. And furthermore, we have to be able to give them help. So I'm pitching the ball into your court and saying, all right, how do we first off, how do we identify we got a genuine problem? And then what kind of help should we be giving them? I'm standing by for answers on that one.
Hey, I really like to jump in right there. I understand exactly what you're saying, and I really, appreciate the comment. It's been my feeling for quite some time now, and I think it's shared by others. I could be wrong. I feel like we're trying to ride too many horses. And if we're going to talk about accountability, let's pick one or maybe two, and let's really focus on improving our outcomes in those two areas. But right now we're being judged by all of those that you mentioned, and it's really difficult for us to focus and make gains in there. I can tell you in our district specifically, years ago when some of our state standards changed for what we were teaching in the classrooms, we were told, focus on these standards, and then the ACT scores will show. When you're achieving in these areas, your ACT scores will go up. And for years, our ACT scores in our district remained some of the lowest in the state until we shifted about 5 years ago, maybe 6, to emphasizing more on ACT and less on our state standards. All right, and understand our state scores had improved greatly during that time. But when we shifted to focusing on the ACT, our ACT scores, we went from a composite score of 18.5 in a short amount of time. We've been over, our ACT composite has been over 20, even nearly 22 in that amount of time. So I would like to narrow our focus on what those accountability measures are so that we can really focus in those areas to improve that.
And Janice, if we can slide our document, which again is on the right of my screen, if we can slide that down to the outcomes section, which will be just off the edge, can we capture that conversation, this will be I guess, just a new bullet. Maybe, or
Yeah.
as we talk about the metrics and the things, so either a new sentence or new paragraph there. Janice, I just want to say in front of everybody, while you are typing, thank you for doing this. I know capturing our conversation and keeping up with our conversation is bound to be difficult, and I appreciate you doing that as best you can. And just for those that might be watching via live stream, or those as committee members, just as a reminder, all of these meetings are being recorded, and so there will be somebody who checks our conversation and checks our work to make sure that it is documented, and we can go back if we miss something, we can go back and review those. And so I hope as you receive the materials that you'll go back and if you need something to listen to the conversation again, and then go back and make sure that matches the things that we have captured that will be submitted up the chain.
Yes, thank you. So does that kind of poke at the things that are coming out? I'm not sure I did hear wanting to narrow. Did we name a measure? That's also a question on the policy that we'll toggle over to some of these questions that came out of the steering committee. They had specific questions to ask us as you're thinking through, like a particular weighted value, or in this instance, connecting to those outcomes, thinking about what might be a good outcome to support middle school and then elementary. And I heard narrowing it down, even thinking about for a K-2 specific. So just pinning that there, did you have anything like in particular that you would want to name for consideration as you noted narrowing?
Were you addressing that in general, or?
Yes, sir.
All right. If you can't see on the screen, this is Reagan talking. I'm going to suggest to you, as the experts in the field, that you are correct. You know, when I trained with the Army decades ago, they had a saying, if it don't move and you can't pick it up, paint it green. That was their key measure, that it be painted green. In the education world, you know, if it don't move and you can't pick it up, you measure it. And teachers universally complain about too much testing. And I can't say I disagree with them. However, I have the philosophy that if it's important enough to know, it's important enough to test. Therefore, what you need to recommend to somebody like me, who's setting policy for you, is that which is important enough to know. And how are we going to test it? As you pointed out earlier, I did mention ACT, I mentioned TN Ready, and I mentioned several others. The point behind my mentioning that was key measures. What is a key measure that applies across the state, that is an indicator to a policymaker in the General Assembly, whether it's me or somebody else, to say, we need to add something to this. We need to put more money in it. We need to put more guidelines on it. We need to tell the state school board to promulgate more rules. In other words, I'm asking you as the experts to say, what is this? Now, I'm going to cut short the conversation too, because I just had some educators in my office yesterday that were pointing out some of the obvious things on ACT. For example, one was a superintendent / director of schools in a rural area, and he very candidly pointed out that he had a bunch of young men in his school who had to take the ACT that had no intention of ever going to college, and they knew what they wanted to do had nothing to do with the ACT. So consequently, their ACT scores came back indicating their care factor rather than their level of knowledge. And that is something that we've got to consider when we talk about the appropriate measures. By the way, I'm not singing ACT praises. Let's get that clear. Whatever measure it is, though, all of you, that is to say, the experts, the practitioners, those who are in the field doing this, need to come to some sort of agreement on what do you think should be the measure. And I agree with the point that 1 or 2 is sufficient, 3 at the most. Those measures that we look at by which we can compare performances and allocate resources in accordance with it. So from my perspective in the policy side of the house, and the reason we're going through this drill in part is because we are changing the way we allocate money, a long overdue change, I might add. But the idea is, how do we change it so that we're doing it better than we were. I'm going to caveat that and say I don't expect to hit perfection, but better than we were in terms of helping our state achieve its education goals and maximum outcomes. We have students in inner cities, for example, academically, they are not concerned at all. They're concerned about, the gang relationships or the drugs or whatever. We have rural students that have no interest in academics because they've already chosen when they get out to go be an apprentice for an electrician, a plumber, pick something, and they see no value in ACT. So that, again, what measure are we going to use? And with that, the sermon is over. I'll turn it back over to you to let me know.
Well, Representative Reagan, I appreciate that, and the call out for inner city schools. So I've got a daughter who is an honor student at one of our inner city schools, and she's got a great education. She's taken 7 AP courses, and I think one of the things that you're speaking to is, a broad construct with testing. I think one of the things, though, that just to call out with Chad is that, the notion of growth. I think we're looking with this next model, and what I would hope that you guys would see with as we measure our educational outcomes is that it is growth oriented. I think, one of the things that I've been about the business of doing with my work is, accountability models and building accountability models that not only award for achievement, and I put that out there in the chat, everybody, just one link to some studies, and Representative knows this very well, is that there's a strong correlation between family income and standardized test performance. But what we know is that there's, the achievement and growth. It's not an either or. And one of the things that we've got in Tennessee, and even kind of based in Tennessee, kind of started things off, is the TVOS growth. So what we could do is say that we were, looking for schools to make some growth in that direction, and definitely want to highlight the achievement. I think one of the things, Representative, too, is the notion of graduation rate, and that's one of the things that our superintendent is focusing on here, and we're really pushing on the issue of making sure that you got those 22 credits, because it does unlock a number of kinds of things. But that what we've also said, and Danny, we've championed this, that there are all those other kinds of issues that we're seeing some great gains in, Representative, that, especially here, our commitment to increasing the number of certifications that our students have. We went from about 200 year before last to over 2,000 this past year. But, all the kinds of CCTE, the college career and technical education progress that we're making here definitely needs to be credited as well.
John, those are all great statements. Thank you for those. Janice, I'm going to ask that you go back to that last line you just typed where you put growth oriented, but let's put growth and achievement in there. So it's not just highlighting growth, but we want to make sure growth and achievement. I think I hear it. And then other state expectations, other points, and again, those CTE participation, CTE completers, and maybe that's deserves another bullet, but certainly that there are other things that school districts are extremely successful in that are not simply measured on a piece of paper too. We can have metrics for them, but it may not be a test that we take. So CTE, participation, completers.
Well, again, let me stress, if I can just jump right in, whatever measures we're going to identify, we all have to agree that these measures are important across the state. They're important in every school district, and we collectively will be able to take action on whether or not those measures are good or bad. The idea is, if they're good, I want to do transportation. I want to transport what is being done in a good system, a good school, to those that need it otherwise. If it's bad, I still want to do transportation, but instead of doing it to, I'm doing it from, to that district. But we must agree on what those districts are and what the measures that those districts are using are. And to your point on CTE, obviously Governor Lee agrees with you. And frankly, a little bit so do I. I mean, we put the marker down and say everybody has to be able to go to college, when in reality, only about 20 or 30% of our student body really needs to go to college. Those are our doctors, our lawyers, our engineers, et cetera, soon to be teachers. But if we look at the 60 or 70% that are going to be doing something that doesn't truly require a college education, CTE certificates, training in the kinds of things that they're going to be earning the career on becomes an important measure. So again, I pitch the ball to you. You guys identify those measures. And again, bearing in mind that those of us that sit up here in the General Assembly have to make the decision on a statewide basis. I can't point to, for example, the school district that was mentioned that, by the way, their urban schools typically do better in ACTs than rural schools. So yeah, good point. But if I'm going to do that, the rural school guys has to say, well, yeah, but 60% of my student population is, going to go work somewhere else doing something else, and they don't need to go to college. So why should I be held accountable for it? And that is a really good question. But if we're making decisions here about how we're going to put the money and other resources into play, by the way, there's a bill that's giving money to schools if we get it passed for structures, buildings, be outside the BEP. That was mentioned, I think, in one of our earlier meetings, and I want you to know some of us were listening. However, that said, we have to have some sort of measure that we all agree on, and I can't stress that enough. Everybody has to agree. Those of you that are on this committee were probably picked to be on this committee because of your interest, proclivities, and your performance. There are 147 school districts in our state, depending on which day you count. Of that, about 141 are what I call plain vanilla. That is to say, you take out School for the Deaf, School for the Blind, the York Institute, et cetera. You wind up with about 141 school districts that we collectively deal with in mass. And so the measures that we use have to be applicable across the board, and they have to enable us to make decisions across the board. So what I'm asking you guys to do is to identify those measures and get back to us and say, we collectively agree. Rural school district here, urban school district here, we agree this measure is important in both places. So I'll be waiting to hear what you've got to say on that one.
I've got
Janice, Steve, let me just,
sure.
Janice, you go underneath that and let's just kind of make a statement that we need a correlation, may not be the right word, but a strong correlation between these outcomes and our accountability model that we are required or forced, that we're measured upon. So that captures, what we're saying is we need to be focusing on those things that the state's going to measure us on, and we need to be a part of that decision-making process. What are those? What are those things in the accountability model? Sorry, Steve, did I interrupt you there?
No, that's good. It made sense. Poke holes in this idea, but we've sent it to our local legislators and several times with high school requiring part of graduation. You have to take the ACT. You have children that don't care. Some are not in that track. So our proposal has been to start in 9th grade with the pre-ACT assessments and then work your way either to a student taking the ACT, their junior, senior year if they wish, but also the work keys, which is another ACT assessment that they could take. And then you could actually, through TN Ready, you're able to figure out what a student should score in 9th grade. It's a norm referenced assessment. And it allows you to pretty easily look at from a school level for accountability measure TVOS. So we're figuring out how much did they grow? Did students come in 9th grade where we expected? 10th grade, how did they improve? 11th grade, how did they improve? Senior year, you're either taking the retake or you're taking work keys, getting ready to go to TCAT or maybe to technical, to a community school, community college. I'm just throwing that out there. It gives the students, the teachers, a lot more time to focus on what they're teaching without end of course exams. I think from the TDOE, of course, I can't speak for them, but I think their thought has always been if we take that away in some districts, the standards won't be taught. I just feel like, that's a system level responsibility to make sure teachers are teaching the standards and doing what they're supposed to be doing. But we've got that in place that we could use for the high school. And to me, it just makes more sense. And to my team, it makes more sense.
I like that, Steve, and I think again my suggestion to Janice here was making sure whatever we're saying and again it's what Representative Reagan said. Whatever we're doing has got to match our accountability model that we're held accountable for and accountable to. So, Janice, again, can we just add the word model there as with that, because all these pieces are going to address how the state revises the accountability model that we're in, or if they do, we all know what that is and how we focus on that. We've been through about 30 to 35 minutes of the funding model. We need to make sure that we leave these next 15 to 20 for policy discussion. So if we want to flip down, Janice, to those policy definitions that we've looked at. Another screen for us to juggle. These are some of those things, and again, helping to recommend some definitions that the group would make sure that we wish these definitions, or we have these questions to answer, that will all impact. We'll go from the framework to the model itself. So our definition of economically disadvantaged. Currently, we use a direct certification. Are there other pieces of that need to be included, or do we need to weight that differently or recommend a different weighting on that?
I think the definition needs to go back to free and reduced lunch and not just direct certification.
I think that's consistent with our conversation we've had in this committee. Poverty, concentration of poverty. Current definition says those are individuals that attend a Title I school.
Yeah, would you, I wonder if including the free and reduced, I think part of that, it connects here as well. Direct certification, families who receive that, they obviously would receive a weighted value, but then to your point, students may be missed in that category. Hey, Commissioner Swin. So wondering then for this definition, obviously if they attend a Title I school, that would be determined they would have that. So that would be, but what about students who maybe are not in a Title I school? That was brought up in another, so not sure if you want to flesh that out more, or if just including free and reduced addresses that well enough.
I know that in our district, we only have two schools. We have an elementary school and a high school. Our elementary school qualifies for Title I, but our high school does not. Same families, siblings in different buildings, and for whatever reason, we can never get our high school to actually meet that threshold. So both schools would be in the same boat based on, our families. So, but I don't know how to make that different other than maybe more intense campaigns to get that changed for our high school, but I don't know how to do that.
Representative Reagan, you have your hand, or is that left over from?
No, that's
okay.
On this one.
Great.
Operational definitions, again, they have to be applicable across the board.
Mm-hmm.
And so the simpler you can make the definition, the more applicable it is. The idea of free and reduced lunch, if you were watching the camera, I was nodding my head, yes, that's well defined, easy to measure, and you can count it. When you start talking about, the example that was brought up was excellent. When you have the same school district with one building at one category, another building at a different category, and they're the same families, our measure is not telling us what we need it to tell us. So that whatever you're going to call this, it should be consistent. That is to say, if you're using free and reduced lunch, I mean, okay, then let's use free and reduced lunch as a percentage of the total student population. Or let's use free and reduced lunch compared to the overall population of that school catchment area. Whatever, pick something. My point is that if it's inconsistent, it's not a good measure.
Right. Thank you. Scrolling down to the next one, sparsity. That's one of those terms that we've talked about as we've talked about rurality and sparsity. Current definition says students per square mile. Janice, when it says that's a range, that is a federal range as well. Is that correct?
Right. I think in our federal definition there, it shows town fringe and distance from a city, but then sparsity, I'm not sure that we actually have a clear definition. So that might be something for the group to discuss, and thinking about how the population is dispersed across an area, and that impact creates more transportation challenges and costs. So it can be that district can be rural, but not necessarily. I've got a chat from the commissioner in there.
Commissioner has clarified that for us. So thank you, Dr. Schwinn. So states have ranged from 10 to 25. So again, that's if we want to narrow that down, or if we like the range. Teacher salaries, I think we've addressed those back in our other concerns from our other bullets above. Tutoring, I know this is one that we talked about quite a bit. Things that would be required of those students who are below on the third grade, beginning 23, 24, funding for legal requirements.
Danny, before we jump past that teacher salaries for the commissioners hearing too, there's a discrepancy between teacher salaries and educator salaries, Commissioner, that we would just call out for you guys to be thinking about, that those might be different words. They might be the same kind of thing, but if educator equals teacher, we just were thinking about the clarity on that one. Sorry about that.
Thank you, John.
Hey, and I'll go back to that as well, the teacher salaries. The question there, are there other policies for teacher salaries that should be included? And my answer would be no, to maintain the flexibility of the districts and the local level to be able to make those adjustments as needed. I think the fewer restrictions placed within the formula, the better.
And Chad, thank you for that. That is, we continue to say this is a funding formula, not a spending plan, and that flexibility is so important. So I think we've highlighted that from start to finish of this committee, and we'll continue to advocate for that. Janice, when I saw this slide, I particularly was interested, why tutoring? Is tutoring just because it's the thing that we're particularly interested in now, we're working on? Because I thought about other programming that either is in place or might be put in place legislatively or policy making. Tutoring is new to us this year, but there are all kinds of other programs that are related to state education policy, sometimes federal education policy, that we also need to capture. And I think, we finally recognize those as unfunded mandates sometimes. So do you know why tutoring just particularly was pulled out? Because I think of summer programming, we had a good discussion of that last time. And again, anything that might be unfunded, I think needs to be addressed.
That's a good point. And I think that is what this is underscoring as well, is that it's currently, there are no funds. We're using ESSER and grant funding to support that strategy, and it's tied to legislation from last year. So I think that's right. Anything to weigh in on that as far as should there be funding? I think in beginning at a year from this spring for the 23-24, we don't have funding for that identified.
There definitely should be funding identified for supports that we're required by law to implement. If we're required through state legislation or federal legislation, as far as that goes, to provide those supports, there should be funding that follows.
Representative Reagan, you had a comment?
Not a comment, a question.
Yes.
Excuse me. Last year, as was pointed out, we had money from the feds, and here in the legislature, we passed enabling legislation to create what we just call summer camps and tutoring. The question that is on the table as far as funding this as part of an ongoing formula is, do we have an assessment that tells us what we did truly moved the needle enough to make it worthwhile? Now, anecdotally, I have, asked people in schools, did that matter? And the answer I've gotten back was yes, it mattered and it helped. But again, I stress that looking across the state, those were anecdotal inputs that I got, not statewide. Did we get enough improvement from those programs to say that, yes, we should continue that funding? Now, of course, improvement, someone mentioned growth earlier, and improvement has the same implication. Did we get enough out of our students that were participating in those programs from where they started to where they ended, and in comparison to students who didn't participate, to justify continuing that? Because quite frankly, from my perspective, again, sitting on education committees in the legislature, I am willing to vote for money for things that work. And if that works and we've got numbers to prove it works, then I'm going to be an advocate. But I need the information across the state from you guys to tell me it works. And I think if Dr. Schwinn is still on, her department may have some of that information. I just may not be privy to it.
I defer to the chair, Director Weeks, if you want me to be able to answer any part of that or not, but you're in charge, my friend.
Not at all. You are in charge when you're with us. Thank you for joining.
So I'm happy to answer where we are on that. So the implications are correct. Right now in law, starting in that year from the Learning Loss and Student Acceleration Bill, all districts would be required to provide tutoring for those students scoring it below. So this was called out explicitly because it can't go in the base goes to everybody. It is to fund that just for those students who qualify. From a return on investment perspective, to your question, Chairman, we will have that information for you on tutoring this summer. This is the first year that we are implementing Tennessee All-Core. So we will be able to tie prior year achievement, those who received the treatment, so to speak, which is that tutoring this year, and then how that, if those students outperformed their similar peers on the TCAP at the end of the year or the universal screener. The second thing I can say anecdotally is we have been tracking our youngest students, so the kind of first, second, third, who are in our summer school programs, looking at their incoming universal screener data for those vendors who have submitted that for that first component. We will have a report for you during the General Assembly as part of our education presentation. I can say we are seeing very positive trends that the summer school application that districts did, and I just want to reiterate, largest first through eighth grade proportional summer school program in the country. We are seeing that positive impact is carried on through the school year. The districts did a pretty remarkable job to see that carry through so clearly. Thank you for that, Director Weeks.
Thank you, Commissioner. Janice, we've got a couple more here. CTE, CTE content feedback.
Mm-hmm.
Waiting on earlier grades. I think we had all talked about the importance of those, receiving that weight at the primary grades. Looking at middle school outcomes, that was one that we have not addressed in any previous conversation. I think we hit number 2 on outcomes of how that matches and mirrors our accountability models.
Mm-hmm.
Public reports, we've done a good job with that, I think. I don't think we've addressed number 5 very well. I think as we talked about last time at the very end of our meeting, and I hate to give it short timing again, but as we know, our funding is based on previous years, selected months, selected weighted months, and we have not really made a recommendation on what we'd like to see. Should that be in real time if this is going to be a student-based model, or as we know, we talked about the volatility of that a little bit as we were wrapping up last week, that would be very volatile if we had some students in and they generated a staff position and then all of a sudden they transferred out of our districts and that funding is no longer there. So does anyone put any more thought into that, Representative?
Thank you. And the answer to your question is yes, some thought's been put into that. Again, those discussions that I've had offline away from this group, which brought up a question. Again, it's policy related in the sense that we've been talking about, and it's been brought up. I think I want to congratulate you on bringing it up, as in students, progressing, taking advanced courses or taking CTE courses and so forth. The question was put to me whether or not we're punishing, quotation marks, school districts and schools that help their students get to the point where they actually graduate early or could graduate early. If they graduate earlier, they no longer have that student in the seat, and therefore they lose a chunk of money.
Right.
So this is related to this funding year, as you're calling this, reporting it. From my perspective, we should be rewarding schools for that student outcome, not punishing them. So the policy related question is, how do we come up with a metric that does that?
The BEP Enhancement Act of 2016 changed where the student graduates early for that current year. Say they graduate in December, we would still receive funding through that year for that student.
Right.
And we have had in the past in our district a student that graduated a full year earlier than her cohort. Would you say that in that situation, the funding would still be available if they graduated a full school year early?
Well, again, my question is that rewarding schools through funding as opposed to punishing them. I don't care which range you're talking about there. We currently, and I think this is a good thing, allow students to do middle college, and we've expanded that where they can go to CTE and get certifications and so forth. So the incentive is there for them to do that, and while they're in high school and potentially become college or career ready well before what would be, as someone said, their cohort. But the incentive for the school is for them to be in that seat, whether it's a whole year early or whatever. So again, funding year implies certain things. Is what we're talking about here, and it's tied into the reporting as well. So what would you suggest as a means of providing rewards to school districts, schools themselves that excel in helping the students? Because ultimately, I mean, let's face facts. The taxpayer is giving the school system money to produce a good citizen, productive graduate. That's what the taxpayer gives the money for. And so if we get that good, productive citizen out there contributing to our society early, everybody benefits. The student, the taxpayer. How do we make sure the school benefits as well? That's my question. And that is tied to the reporting.
Right. Thank you. And I may have answered, or I may see the answer. I didn't realize in the next box it asks us about ADM shifts. Should there be hold harmless in those fixed costs. And I think that's our yes that we talked about last time, that, you know, we can't be so tied to a formula that it wrecks our budget if a student or small group of students transfer in and out of our districts. Good point there. We are at 1 o'clock. Is there anything that we need to make sure gets recorded for today's meeting purposes before we have to close today?
This is Representative Reagan. I know you're not getting to the next question, but I want to point out that that's a very important one. There are 3 school districts in my legislative district, and in one case, they contribute a significant amount of money, and it's metropolitan. They're worried about changes in their economic status and the maintenance of effort requirement of them in the school district. So I just want to point out that's an important one to make sure we get to before the end of this discussion. Not today necessarily, but before our entire discussion.
Hold me accountable to make sure we put that on for next week. Let's start there.
Mhm.
I agree. That one's very important.
Yeah. Janice, you have that captured somewhere. I'm sure you'll get that back on there. Okay.
Yes, I will.
Okay.
Sure.
Ladies
All
and we've had a lot of rich conversation today. Thank you for that. Thank you for your homework, because I know you're doing a lot of preparation and a lot of discussion to get to the point where we can come today to have these discussions. So thank you for that. Thank you for your participation. Wanted to shout out to Mark Florence. Thank you for joining us today, Mark. We've been thinking about you, and glad to see you with us today. Thank you for joining. And we would remind everybody that our last meeting is scheduled for next Thursday at noon. And Janice, you'll be sending us some materials and documents. And again, remind everyone that these are posted after they'll be processed. They'll be posted on the state funding website. So if we can help you, our emails are out there and our addresses are out there, and we look forward to seeing everyone next week.
Perfect.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you.